For 20 years she woke up beside him every single morning, 20 years of shared prayers, Sunday sermons, and a life built on faith. But the man sleeping next to her wasn't who she thought he was, and when she finally discovered the truth, it would lead to a crime so shocking that an entire Florida community would be left asking one haunting question: how well do we really know the people we love? This is the story of Sarah Mitchell, a devoted wife and steadfast believer, married to Pastor Michael Thompson, one of the most respected religious leaders in their small Florida town. For 2 decades, their marriage appeared to be the gold standard, a beacon of faith and commitment that inspired everyone around them. Michael stood at the pulpit every Sunday, his voice commanding yet gentle, preaching about honesty, trust, and the sacred bond of marriage. Sarah sat in the front pew, her smile warm and genuine, the picture of a supportive wife. Their home was always open, their door always welcoming. Neighbors would often say they wished their marriages could be half as strong as the Thompsons. But as we'll soon discover, even the most perfect-looking relationships can hide secrets so devastating they destroy everything in their path. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Sarah had met Michael when she was just 23 years old, fresh out of college and searching for purpose. He was already an associate pastor then, charismatic and deeply committed to his calling. Their courtship felt like a fairy tale, filled with long conversations about faith, family, and building a life together in service to something greater than themselves. They married within a year, and Sarah threw herself into supporting Michael's ministry. She organized church events, counseled troubled parishioners, and stood by his side through every challenge. Their intimate life, while private, seemed normal to Sarah, though looking back she would recall small moments that never quite made sense. The lights always had to be off. Michael insisted on complete darkness during their most intimate moments, claiming it helped him feel more connected spiritually. It seemed odd but harmless, just another quirk in a marriage filled with love and mutual respect. For years, Sarah accepted this without question. She trusted him completely. After all, this was a man who spoke to hundreds of people every week about integrity and righteousness. This was a man who counseled couples through their darkest moments, who baptized their children, who presided over their weddings and funerals. How could someone like that harbor a secret so profound it would shake the very foundation of everything Sarah believed? It was a Tuesday afternoon in March when Sarah's world collapsed. Michael had left for a church meeting, and Sarah was doing something completely ordinary, something she'd done 1,000 times before. She was putting away laundry in their bedroom dresser when her hand brushed against something unusual in the back of Michael's drawer, tucked beneath layers of clothing. At first, she couldn't identify what she was touching. The texture was strange, unfamiliar. She pulled it out slowly, her heart beginning to race even before her mind could process what she was seeing. It was a prosthetic device, carefully hidden and clearly used for one very specific purpose. Sarah's hands began to shake. The room seemed to tilt around her. For several minutes, she just stood there, staring at this object that represented the complete shattering of her reality. Every intimate moment of their 20-year marriage flashed through her mind in a new, horrifying context. The insistence on darkness, the specific positions, the way Michael always controlled every aspect of their physical relationship. It all made sense now, and the understanding felt like drowning. But the discovery of the prosthetic was only the beginning. As Sarah's shock turned to frantic searching, she found more items hidden throughout their bedroom, evidence of a deception so calculated and sustained that it took her breath away. How long had he been doing this? From the very beginning? Had their entire marriage been built on this lie? Sarah felt physically ill. She sat on the edge of their bed, the same bed where she'd slept peacefully for 2 decades, and realized she didn't know her husband at all. The confrontation that evening was explosive. When Michael came home, Sarah was waiting, the prosthetic laid out on their dining room table like evidence at a crime scene. His face went pale the moment he saw it. For a few seconds he tried to explain, to minimize, to somehow make this acceptable. He claimed it was because of a medical condition he'd been too embarrassed to discuss. He said he loved her and was trying to protect her from his shame. He begged her to understand that everything else about their marriage was real, but Sarah couldn't hear any of it. 20 years of her life felt like a lie. Every moment of intimacy they'd shared was now tainted by the knowledge that he'd been deceiving her in the most profound way possible. The man who preached about truth from the pulpit every Sunday had been living a calculated deception in the privacy of their bedroom. Over the following weeks, Sarah spiraled. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think about anything except the betrayal. She looked at Michael and felt nothing but disgust and rage. Friends at church noticed she seemed distant, but she couldn't tell anyone. How could she explain this to their community? How could she admit that their perfect pastoral marriage was a complete fraud? The humiliation felt suffocating. Michael tried to act as though nothing had changed, still preaching on Sundays, still counseling couples, still playing the role of the devoted husband in public. But at home, the tension was unbearable. They barely spoke. When they did, it often erupted into screaming matches where 20 years of suppressed doubts and questions came pouring out. It was a humid Friday night in late April when everything reached its breaking point. They'd had another argument, this one particularly vicious. Michael had accused Sarah of overreacting, of throwing away 2 decades over something he called a minor issue. Those words, minor issue, sent Sarah into a rage unlike anything she'd ever experienced. This wasn't minor. This was her entire adult life, her entire sense of reality, shattered by his selfishness and deception. That night, after Michael had gone to bed, Sarah sat alone in their living room, staring at their wedding photo on the mantel. The smiling faces in that picture felt like strangers now. She thought about all the women who had come to her over the years, seeking advice about their troubled marriages, and how she'd confidently counseled them, believing her own marriage was strong and true. She thought about how Michael had stood before their congregation countless times, preaching about honesty and the sanctity of marriage vows, while hiding this massive deception from her. The anger built inside her like a physical force. Around 2 a.m, Sarah walked into their bedroom. Michael was asleep, his breathing steady and peaceful. How could he sleep so calmly? How could he continue on as though he hadn't destroyed everything? Sarah stood there in the darkness, the same darkness Michael had always insisted upon during their intimate moments, and something inside her snapped. What happened next would change everything forever. In that dark bedroom, with her husband sleeping peacefully, Sarah made a choice that would end 2 lives, even though only one would stop breathing. The details of that night are difficult to recount, but they're essential to understanding how 20 years of hidden deception led to an irreversible tragedy. Sarah retrieved Michael's handgun from the bedside table, a weapon he kept for protection in their quiet suburban neighborhood. Her hands were steady as she stood over him. When Michael woke and saw her standing there, his expression shifted from confusion to fear in an instant. He raised his hands and began pleading, promising to leave, to give her space, to do whatever she wanted. But Sarah was beyond hearing him. In her mind, this wasn't just about the prosthetic anymore. This was about every lie, every manipulation, every moment of false intimacy built on deception. This was about the violation of her trust in the most profound way possible. When she pulled the trigger, the sound shattered the silence of their suburban street. Neighbors would later report hearing the gunshot, but assuming it was a car backfiring. For several minutes, Sarah just stood there, looking at what she'd done, the reality slowly penetrating through the fog of rage that had consumed her. Then she walked calmly to the phone and called emergency services. Her voice was eerily calm as she told the dispatcher what had happened, giving her address and waiting on the front porch for the police to arrive. When they pulled up, lights flashing in the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah was sitting quietly, hands folded in her lap, looking nothing like a woman who had just committed murder. The news spread through their Florida community like wildfire. Pastor Michael Thompson, beloved religious leader, had been shot and killed by his wife of 20 years. The initial reaction was complete disbelief. Sarah Mitchell, the gentlewoman who organized church bake sales and visited sick parishioners, had murdered her husband? It seemed impossible. But as details began to emerge during the investigation and subsequent trial, the story became even more shocking. The prosthetic device, the years of deception, the calculated nature of Michael's hidden secret, all became public knowledge. The community was torn. Some felt immense sympathy for Sarah, viewing her as a victim who had been pushed to an unthinkable breaking point after decades of profound betrayal. Others saw her as a cold-blooded killer who had taken a life over something that could have been resolved through divorce and counseling. The trial was sensational, covered by local and national media. Sarah's defense team argued that she had been emotionally and psychologically abused through years of sexual deception, that the discovery of Michael's secret had triggered a psychological break. Prosecutors painted her as a vindictive woman who had committed premeditated murder rather than simply leaving her marriage. Character witnesses came forward with conflicting testimonies. Church members described Michael as a compassionate leader and Sarah as a devoted partner. But others whispered about controlling behavior they'd noticed over the years, subtle signs that perhaps the Thompson marriage hadn't been as perfect as everyone believed. Sarah herself testified, describing in painful detail the moment of discovery and the psychological devastation that followed. She spoke about feeling violated in a way that went beyond physical betrayal, about the shattering of her entire sense of reality and self. The courtroom was silent as Sarah described that final night, her voice steady but empty of emotion, as though she was describing events that had happened to someone else. She admitted she had thought about killing him, that it wasn't a sudden impulse but a decision that had crystallized over those horrible weeks following her discovery. This admission damaged her defense significantly. The prosecution argued that this proved premeditation, that Sarah had consciously chosen murder over any other option. Her attorneys countered that the prolonged psychological trauma she'd experienced had impaired her judgment, that someone subjected to such profound and sustained deception couldn't be held to the same standard of rational decision-making. The jury deliberated for 3 days. In the end, they found Sarah guilty of second-degree murder, acknowledging some element of emotional disturbance, but ultimately concluding that she had made a conscious choice to take her husband's life. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison. As she was led away in handcuffs, Sarah looked back at the courtroom one final time. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of relief and devastation. In that moment, everyone watching understood that regardless of the verdict, Sarah's life as she had known it was over. The woman who had dedicated decades to faith, service, and what she believed was a sacred marriage would spend the rest of her life behind bars, forever defined by one violent act, born from years of hidden pain. The church where Michael had preached was left to grapple with impossible questions about the man they'd trusted and admired. How had no one known? Had there been signs they'd all missed? Could this tragedy have been prevented if Michael had been honest from the beginning? 6 months after the trial, during a prison interview, Sarah was asked if she regretted what she'd done. Her answer was unsettling in its honesty. She said she regretted many things, that she wished Michael had been truthful with her from the start, that she wished she'd had the strength to simply walk away, that she wished she'd sought help for the rage consuming her in those final weeks. But when pressed about the actual act of pulling the trigger, she simply said she didn't know how to answer that question anymore. Life in prison had given her plenty of time to reflect, but it hadn't provided clarity. Some days she was horrified by what she'd done, unable to reconcile the person she'd been with the person who committed murder. Other days, she felt only numbness, as though the Sarah who had lived as Pastor Thompson's wife had died that night too, leaving behind someone completely different. Psychologists who evaluated her noted that she exhibited symptoms of complex trauma and dissociation, consistent with someone who had experienced prolonged psychological abuse. But they also acknowledged that mental anguish, however profound, didn't justify taking a life. Sarah's case became a talking point in discussions about deception in intimate relationships, about the psychological impact of sustained betrayal, and about the point at which a victim's response to abuse crosses into criminal behavior. There were no easy answers, no clear moral lines. Everyone who learned about the case seemed to come away with a different perspective, their reactions often reflecting their own experiences with trust and betrayals. Today, Sarah remains incarcerated, her days structured by the rigid routine of prison life, a stark contrast to the busy, purpose-driven existence she once led as a pastor's wife. She participates in counseling programs and has become something of a quiet presence in the prison community, helping other inmates navigate their own struggles. Some of her former church friends have maintained contact through letters, though many others couldn't reconcile the woman they knew with the crime she committed. The house where the Thompsons lived was sold, purchased by a family unaware of its dark history. The church found a new pastor, someone who worked hard to help the congregation heal from the scandal and tragedy that had shaken their foundation. But among those who knew Michael and Sarah, the questions linger. How could someone maintain such a profound deception for 20 years? What does it say about intimacy and trust that such a secret could be hidden in plain sight for so long? And perhaps most unsettling, at what point does betrayal become so unbearable that a person loses their sense of right and wrong entirely? These questions don't have comfortable answers. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the complexity of human relationships, about the masks people wear, and about the devastating consequences when those masks finally slip. This story isn't just about one woman's crime or one man's deception. It's about the fragile nature of trust and the catastrophic destruction that follows when that trust is shattered completely. It's about how years of living a lie, whether as the deceiver or the deceived, can corrupt everything it touches until nothing recognizable remains. Sarah Mitchell will spend decades behind bars for what she did in those dark early morning hours. Michael Thompson is gone, his legacy forever complicated by the secret he kept and the violence it ultimately provoked. And an entire community was forced to reckon with the reality that they never really knew either of them at all. So I'm asking you now, where do you draw the line? Can deception of this magnitude ever be forgiven? Or does it justify a response as extreme as Sarah's? If you discovered that your partner had been deceiving you in such a fundamental way for decades, how would you respond? Would you find the strength to walk away, or would rage consume you too? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story affected you, if it made you think about trust and betrayal in your own life, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming videos. Because the truth is, we never really know what's happening behind closed doors, even in the lives that seem most perfect from the outside.